Thank you, Jasper Robert, and good morning to you all. Indeed, I'm here to talk about projections of future emissions. My name is Jasper Faber. I'm with CE Delft, which is an independent research and consultancy. We've been in existence for over 40 years, with more than half of that time working on climate policies for shipping and environmental policies for shipping. And we have a very broad client base, ranging from IMO to ports, from environmental NGOs to shipping companies, governments as well. I want to talk this morning about three main issues. First of all, the emission projections, where I want to touch upon the methods employed in making projections into the future. Reinhard Lueken alluded to uncertainty, and that uncertainty was a key issue at the last conference, and certainly also at this conference. There was uncertainty for the next 1.5 years, when you're making projections for 30, 40, 50 years in the future. The uncertainty only becomes bigger, of course. I want to show you some results of work we've done on emission projections, and how we can improve the methods and will improve the methods in the future to hopefully come up with better emission projections. I want to briefly touch upon the initial greenhouse gas strategy in comparison and relation to the emission projections, because it shows kind of the scale of the effort that the shipping sector needs to undertake, and end with conclusions. Probably most in this room will have heard that the sentence by various people: shipping emissions are projected to increase by up to 250% by 2050. And then often a reference is made to the third IMO greenhouse gas study. We were responsible for the emission projection part in the third IMO greenhouse gas study. It is true that this projection of increase up to 250% by 2050 is one of the scenarios that is included in the third IMO greenhouse gas study. But what is often left out when people refer to the 250% is that the projection depends on assumptions. And the 250% increase in emissions assumes a future in which countries, land-based sectors, continue to rely heavily on fossil fuels. So there's a lot of shipping of coal and oil and gas. And also a future with very high economic growth rates. We hope, of course, that the society will move away from fossil fuels and have smarter ways of producing the energy that we need. So that already signifies that the 250% is maybe unlikely. And then also the high economic growth rates that were at the basis of these projections were originally thought of in the early 2000s, when before the crisis, when there was a lot of optimism about future economic development, which is not the case anymore today. In two studies for BIMCO, we have analyzed how emission projections depend on these factors and updated them using basically the same methodology as in the third IMO greenhouse gas study, but with improved data and more up-to-date assumptions. How do we do it? Our model of projecting emissions basically starts with a projection of transport work into the future, which depends on how much demand there is for various commodities and on economic growth. Then there is several factors that all relate to the efficiency by which the transport work is delivered. So how much energy is needed to move 1 ton of cargo over 1 mile. And we have broken that down because, of course, for container shipping it's different than for bulk shipping. So we've broken that down into various ship segments. And then there are, of course, assumptions about the fuel mix in the future. And those three components result in projections of emissions. And in order to account for the uncertainty that I alluded to, we don't pretend to know what the future holds. But one way to counter the uncertainty is to work with several scenarios of plausible futures and look at the spread in those scenarios and how large the spread is in order to get a feeling of where we might end up. One key element is the projection of transport work demand. And here in the third IMO greenhouse gas study, we've looked at historical transport work data and historical world GDP growth data, and we've related one to the other and assumed that the relation between transport work and GDP would follow kind of an S-curve, where at the beginning of economic development you see very slow growth and growth picks up, but as economies mature and as the world economy matures, the growth kind of levels off. And that's what you see here in the left-hand panel. This leads to increases in transport work that for most of the shipping segments lag somewhat the current or the GDP projections. Then for some commodities, especially oil and coal, we used projections of how these would evolve under various future climate scenarios. In the more, let's say, in the scenarios that are more in line with the Paris Agreement, all of these tail off, as you can see here, and that also means that the transport demand for coal and oil will reduce over time. And in more ambitious climate policy scenarios, they tail off faster than in the less ambitious climate policy scenarios. Here are some examples of how we related GDP to transport work, and you see these S-curves for the various ship segments. What you can also note in this scenario, or in this graph, is that where we are currently on this S-curve is very different for different segments of shipping. The main results of our the last iteration of this work we did for BIMCO is shown in this figure. The thick green line is one scenario where the whole world moves towards a well below 2 degrees target, in combination with world GDP projections taken from the most recent projections of the OECD. In this projection, coupled with efficiency improvements in shipping under business as usual scenarios, so meaning no big steps in EEDI or no further slow steaming than we currently have, we see emissions increase by about 20% over 2008 levels by 2050. Of course, we've come down quite considerably after the financial crisis, and we see a slow increase in the coming years to this 20% over the historical peak. If you assume more optimistic world GDP projections, those are the yellow and the light blue line, you end up with higher emissions that in our current scenarios achieve 50% higher emissions in 2050 than in 2008. And the main difference between the green line on the one hand and the blue and the yellow line on the other hand is the difference in future economic growth, because both these scenarios assume that coal and oil will be phased out. For comparison, I've also drawn the line in this graph of the minimum level of emission in the initial strategy, where you have a 40% improvement in carbon intensity in 2030. That's the start of the thick brown yellowish line, and then an absolute reduction of 50% relative to 2008 in 2050. And again, I'd like to underscore that these are minimum levels of ambition included in the initial strategy. Yeah, I'll come back to that in the next slide. The fourth IMO greenhouse gas study, which will start soon, and in which we will be involved as well, aims to improve the method for emission projections by updating the marginal abatement cost curve, which underlies our assessment of how the efficiency of the fleet improves over time as certain technologies have matured, become more potent or cheaper. They are more likely to be taken up. We'll also update the fuel mix projections, and we want to improve the transport demand projections by complementing the current approach, which relies on comparison of historical trend lines, with a more trade economic approach. And for the ones in the room that are familiar with trade economics, we'll use a gravity model of trade, and so are able to say, well, if certain regions in the world grow faster and others grow slower, how does, on those routes, the demand for transport evolve, so that we can take a more closer look at how transport demand will develop. Coming back to the initial IMO strategy on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for ships. It has this line of levels of ambition, minimum levels of ambition, as well as candidate short-term measures, mid-term measures, and long-term measures. The short-term measures aim primarily at improving the efficiency of shipping. And we've heard Roger say that they have improved their efficiency by 32% relative to 2008 levels, right? They're a little bit ahead of over what the industry average is. They're also laggards, but in order to achieve a 40% improvement at least, so maybe even a higher improvement, a lot of shipping companies still need to do a lot of work, and that's where the initial short-term measures aim for. Then there are mid and long-term measures, which should take shipping from the fossil fuel area that we're currently in to the renewable fuel era that is required in order to have zero emissions through a transitional period. And I want to briefly dwell on the different measures. The short-term measures, there are several that have been proposed by states and observer organizations to the IMO. All these measures are different, with different obligations for ships and different indicators of compliance, but they have one thing in common. For most ships, they require a reduction of operational speed, unless you have other means to significantly improve your efficiency. But our models show that without a reduction of operational speed, it's very hard to achieve the 40% or even higher efficiency improvement. The difference between the measures is whether they will also allow for other measures to comply, other options to comply, such as alternative fuels, energy efficiency devices, etc. Then there are the mid and long-term measures that should enable the transition from fossil fuels to zero carbon fuels that Carlo talked about. And there are a number of policy options. One could stipulate the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel, kind of with the sulfur regulation, but then not regulating the carbon content of the fuel. They could also reduce the cost of non-fossil fuels, through subsidies. That's of course not a sustainable policy, because it would require large amounts of subsidies to the sector, or it could increase the cost of fossil fuel use by a fuel levy or an emission trading scheme, or potentially a combination of these two. We don't know what in the end the IMO will decide. We may know in 4 or 5 years' time. But it seems likely that under any of these scenarios, the cost of using fossil fuel will go up and the cost of using alternative fuels will go down. The mid and long-term measures should be in effect around 2030 in order to incentivize the transition to zero carbon fuels. That means that ships ordered and built today will also be operated in a future in which these policies are implemented. We also know that the new fuels will place different requirements on ships, for example, different fuel systems because of the different properties of the fuels, especially when you think about liquid ammonia, hydrogen or biomethane. Some of them may require fuel cells rather than internal combustion engines to convert the fuel into useful energy. And the future at this point in time looks uncertain. There are questions, will a dominant fuel emerge like we currently have, which of course has huge benefits to the industry. You can bunker HFO anywhere in the world. You can hire an engineer from another shipping company because he will know how to handle an internal combustion engine. But it's also possible that because of the diversity of these fuels, we will end up with a larger diversity in the fuels in the future. It leads me to conclude that there could be a premium for flexibility in new ships with regards to the use of different fuels. To conclude, maritime CO2 emissions are projected to increase by 20 to 50% over 2008 levels, and at least that's what our current projection, depending on the economic and associated transport demand growth and the energy transition in land-based sectors. The fourth IMO greenhouse gas study will update these projections, and probably by the end of next year we will have slightly different figures. The initial IMO strategy on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships requires that emissions peak as soon as possible and be reduced by at least 50% in 2050, and the carbon intensity of maritime transport improves by at least 40% in 2030 and 70% in 2050. And this requires additional regulation, amongst others, to increase the use of zero carbon fuels. That was my final slide. Thank you.